The first one is found in verse 25. Therefore, each of you must put off falsehood and speak truthfully to his neighbor, for we're all members of one body. Lying is not new. We've been lying ever since we were taught how to lie by the serpent in the garden. The serpent lied, deceived Adam and Eve deceives God. They hide their truth of their misconduct behind clothings of figs and an alcove of foliage. But when they're discovered, even when they're discovered, Adam and Eve, they share half-truths with God, telling them about others who are culpable of their misconduct. Neither Adam nor Eve say, yes, I disobeyed you, God. They don't just say that. And we continue to wear this deception as clothing. When was the last time that you've heard a child say to his or her parent, yes, I've disobeyed you? When was the last time you heard that? I mean, kids, if you want to give your mom a heart attack, you just say that. Next time you do something wrong, you just say, yes, I've disobeyed you. I apologize. You'll give her a heart attack. I promise. Because you never hear it. You never hear it. You hear justifications. Oh, we tell ourselves legends about George Washington, who supposedly said, I cannot tell a lie. I've cut down the cherry tree. But you go to Ferry Farms in Fredericksburg, Virginia, where he allegedly did this. You talk with historians that have devoted their whole life to George Washington, to studying this life, this one man, and they'll say, oh, that's just a legend. It never happened. But I could have told you that. It never does happen. You never hear people taking off this clothing of deception and putting on truth, at least in their own power. From the White House to the outhouse, from the jailhouse to God's house, we all wear this clothing of deception, and a little too comfortably, too. No, God calls us to cast off falsehood, but also to put on truth. In a few weeks, we'll be covering the armor of God, the last sermon in Ephesians, and among this armor is called the belt of truth. The belt of truth. And I imagine if soldiers wore suspenders back then, they'd probably be called the suspenders of truth. But a belt, a suspender, they all serve the same purpose. They keep you together, right? Without a belt, you'll be looking like a fool with your pants on the ground, right? No, you got to have a belt to put everything together, to keep everything together. And that's what truth does. It keeps you as one person. It keeps you from being duplicitous, from being one person to one and another person to another. God calls us to put on truth, to take off our deception and to put on truth. Number 2, in verse 28. He who has been stealing must steal no longer, but must work, doing something useful with his own hands, so that he may have something to share with those in need. We're called to take off this old clothing of thievery. Now, stealing is probably just as popular and been around just as long as lying. And you might say, oh, Pastor Rich, I promise you, I have never stolen a thing in my life. Well, perhaps you're not guilty of stealing according to U.S. law, but we're called to a higher law, a moral law given by Christ. And we have all stolen. Perhaps we've stolen someone's good name through gossiping. Perhaps we've stolen someone's praise by taking credit for what they've done. Perhaps we've stolen God's honor by disobeying God. But we've all stolen. And what does Paul say is the opposite of stealing? What does he say in this passage? It's sharing, right? Generosity, to give. Stealing is making someone give something up by force, whether it's physical force or stealthy force or force of position. That's what stealing is. You take something from someone by force. And giving, on the other hand, is to give something willingly, right? That's what generosity is. And that's why Jesus says, I believe on the Sermon on the Mount, if somebody takes your cloak, somebody takes your jacket, then you give them your shirt. That's generosity defeating thievery. Or if somebody forces you to walk a mile, then you'll walk 2 miles. That's generosity defeating thievery. I think about Pilate and the others who were responsible for crucifying Jesus. They wanted to steal his life away. But little did they know that Jesus had already chosen to give his life. We're not called to follow Pilate's example of stealing, but Jesus' example of giving. And if I had more time, I talk about the necessity of Christians to give to the church, to give to those in need, to make it a habit of giving. We're called to take off this clothing of stealing and put on generosity. And third and final point we find in verse 29. Do not let any unwholesome talk come out of your mouths, but only what is helpful for building others up. It's a hard thing to convince Americans because of our culture. But sometimes silence is more valuable and definitely rarer than some things that we say.